You are listening to the Propaganda Podcast with Tajmika Torak and Shannon Perez Darby. Today we are talking about a movie called The Sound of Freedom. Buckle up, people. This is going to be a mess.
This is the first thing for this podcast that is like a true hate watch for me, where I was like, oh, this is horrible. And I cannot wait to talk to Tajmika about it. The first thing that I want to say to folks is do not watch this movie. We have watched Sound of Freedom, so you don't have to. This isn't one of those things where I'm like, oh, it's so bad, it's worth watching. Do not watch it, please.
Listen, this is a service that we are providing. And just to show your gratitude, you need to make a commitment to not watch this terrible movie.
Or give any money to anyone involved in any way, shape, or form. Don't give them your likes, your views, or any of your money, please.
It's not one of those moments, and I know we all have that in this field where we're like, well, but at least they're doing this. And you're like, that could be fine. To be clear, this is not that situation. So please stay away.
You cannot unsee this movie, so don't do it. Well, I can start with a little synopsis of Sound of Freedom, and then we can get into it.
Woo! Let's go.
So, Sound of Freedom is, quote, based on a true story. And we can come back to that assertion a little bit later. It is following a real life person, Tim Ballard, who is a Homeland Security ICE agent. The real life Tim Ballard worked on the southern border for 10 years. And you don't get a lot of intro about exactly who he is or what his position is. But the very, very short version is there is a young boy he quote unquote rescues from a white man trafficker and abuser, which sends him on a journey of wanting to rescue children who have been quote unquote trafficked into sexual slavery.
I just want to say, I'm just going to interrupt really quick and just say that the amount of restraint that it takes to not interrupt at every single word that you say, it's so rough. There's so many things, but please, I'm just going to sit here and endure it because I know the commentary is coming, but it's killing me. It's killing me.
We're going to describe what it is and then we are going to rip it apart. So don't even worry. So there's a particular girl who is the sister of the boy Miguel, who was being harmed in this movie, being trafficked in this movie. The next scene is the most football-loving white boy American policeman I have ever seen, is how I have described my first introduction to our friend Tim.
Timoteo.
Whew.
By the way, if you're wondering, this is not someone who is from a culture or identity that should have the name Timoteo.
Yo me llamo Tim Ballard, pero me puedes llamar Timoteo.
Long story short, he goes to Colombia. He somehow convinces this rich man to set up a trap for the traffickers to rescue 50 plus children.
Oh.
He does not successfully rescue the girl he goes to rescue. And then for some reason that's unclear to me, he finds his way by himself into the jungles of Colombia to go single-handedly rescue her from her traffickers.
I have so many things to say about that part. It hurts my soul. I want to go on your journey.
So a couple of things about just this movie in context. So those are some of the plot points. We're following the most white boy, real life person, Tim Ballard, through what is supposed to be based on a true story. The context in pop culture is just as important. So this movie brings in $242 million worldwide when it is released on July 4th, 2023. Some interesting facts I learned is that Donald Trump held a screening of this film shortly after it was released.
That sounds right.
The actor who plays Tim Ballard is Jim, I can never pronounce his right name.
It's Caviezel.
Caviezel, thank you. Tajmika, do you know what Jim Caviezel is famous for?
The Passion of the Christ is my recollection.
The Passion of the Christ.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Movies it beat out that it was released at the same time. The new Mission Impossible, which we spoke about in our last episode. The new Indiana Jones that was released at the same time.
Wow.
Box office wise, Sound of Freedom beat both of those films, and they were released in the same kind of summer blockbuster time, which I think is really important pop cultural information for us to have.
Wild.
Wild.
That is wild because, number one, just objectively, even if I didn't have a problem with all the things we're going to talk about today, just objectively, both of those other movies are better. I don't even know that I've seen the Indiana Jones movie. I think I have, but I have a long history. As kids, we watched those movies. We got grounded from them. I don't know if I ever told you that. We got grounded from the Indiana Jones movies.
You did. We talk about it in the podcast.
Okay, good. So we love those. So hands down, it's already without any question better. And I am struggling. I'm just thinking about the choice that was made there and who was making those choices. And I feel I'm scratching my head. You can't hear it, but I literally am scratching my head right now because I don't understand how those choices were made. That is interesting. Wow. Okay.
So Tim Ballard, I just want to talk about Tim Ballard, the real life human being who the story is based around. He is a real person.
Yes, he is.
Do you know anything about the organization he founded, Tashmika?
No, because I was waiting for this fucking story time. Let's go. Tell me everything.
I want to tell you the name of the organization that he co-founded. It is called...
I almost feel like I want to stop you because I'm so excited. It's like it's going to be so terrible. And once I know it's like getting it's not a Christmas present. I know that this is terrible, but also once I know, I'm never going to not know again.
I have some receipts for you. I have some screen shares for you. Okay. The organization that Jim Ballard co-founded is called Operation Underground Railroad.
I want to give a verbal response because I know people can't see me, but I cannot even get my brain to make a thing happen right now because that is so outlandishly inappropriate. That's it. My mouth it shouldn't even be surprising though. I mean, that is what white evangelical Christian people have been doing, is like rebranding enslavement as a human trafficking current issue, just like they've rebranded racism as a target on white men's back. So it's like not surprising. And also it's just, why not use new words? Let's just pretend like you don't agree with me on that. Cool, fine, whatever. But there are a million words. We even name things that aren't even in English. Choose a Latin word. Choose a biblical connotation. The Underground Railroad, that is so disrespectful.
Oh, Tashmika, we're getting to it.
Oh.
Don't worry, they evolve. They evolve to the biblical connotations.
Oh, of course they do.
I am going to share a screenshot with you that I would like you to describe and then read for us.
Okay.
This is from the Operation Underground Railroad, of which their acronym is R. So they call it R Rescue.
I'm so upset. I already just looked at the link, Shannon, and it says Abolitionist Club. Man, here we go. Also, you don't need to look it up. I will read it.
This is the thing. Don't go to their website. We've gone as many hits as they need. We will read it to you.
And this is the last time I guarantee that I will be on this website.
Yes.
It says Abolitionist Club make a direct impact in the fight to end human trafficking by becoming a monthly donor. The Abolitionist Club are a community of monthly donors who are committed to putting an end to modern-day slavery. With over 50,000 members from all over the world, we are on a mission to free survivors from sex trafficking and exploitation. What is an abolitionist? Oh, please tell me. An abolitionist is a person who helps put an end to the practice of slavery. Our draws inspiration from the history of the 19th century Underground Railroad and the abolitionists who stood up to the injustice of slavery in the United States. We learn from the courageous stories of the original abolitionists and apply it to the fight in which we are engaged today, the fight to end modern-day slavery in all of its forms. There are benefits to being this is like a Patreon. An abolitionist, by definition, sure. But just because I put abolitionist on the back of a police cruiser does not make an abolitionist. This is not an abolitionist club. This is a cop.
I didn't do a very deep dive into the whole personnel related to Operation Underground Railroad, but the best that I can tell is that there are no Black people, at the very least in leadership. And so it is fucking bold to call your organization Operation Underground Railroad, to say you're in some kind of conversation with the abolition of chattel slavery. That is a bold leap to make. To not have meaningful leadership from African American folks, particularly, is wild.
Right. It's a similar energy for the entire movie, because the whole thing that they're doing is bold and miseducated. You know, I have said a million times that if I could just sprinkle a little Jesus on my organization, I know I would make more money. It just is the reality. I want to make sure that I'm being clear about the kind of Christian evangelical. This is a very specific group of people that require no more than for me to just say, because Jesus, and then that's it. That's the whole justification. We don't need data. We don't need evidence. We don't need really anything beyond faith. That is very problematic, which is why even when I was someone who considered myself a practicing participant in the Christian faith, I still would never name my organization or move any work related to sexual violence did not belong to me under the umbrella of the church. I mean, it was a strategic choice towards having less money, but also having more integrity. This is not what this is, you know? So I believe there's another link I'm supposed to be clicking. I haven't clicked it yet.
This is the second link, which is actually a perfect connection. So this is to the store at Operation Underground Railroad at their website. And I'd like you to click on that. And while you're doing that, I can read out loud some of the titles of the merchandise that you could purchase to support Operation Underground.
I'm sorry. I just have to tell you really quickly that, you know, people know I have 3 children. My eldest is 20, my middle is 18, and my youngest is 15. And while I was watching this movie in parts, I didn't watch it all in one sitting. My youngest happened to be sitting on the couch next to me while I was watching it. And there is a moment where Timoteo says, because God's children are not for sale.
Exactly.
And I turned, looked at my son, and as I looked at him, his eyes popped up and just looked at me and was like, "What?
What are you watching? Mom, what do you want to get?" I can just see him just be like, is this what you're doing right now? What are you doing right now?
That's exactly the energy. He was like, "Who talks like that? What is going on?"
Because it's cuckoo cuckoo. The whole movie, everything around it, all of the stuff, it's all cuckoo cuckoo. Like, it's wacky.
How'd that make you feel? Giving a child his freedom.
Felt good.
You have been at this for 12 years.
My country, 'tis of thee.
Why are you doing it?
Sweet land of liberty.
Because God's children are not for sale.
So the very first piece of merchandise you can buy are t-shirts that have the organization's tag, God's children are not for sale. And so you hear that in the movie. You can buy merch, various kinds of hats and shirts that say God's children are not for sale. One of my favorites is a Bold and Free t-shirt that you can get. Everything has American flag branded stuff on it. And it really looks like the Blue Lives Matter flag.
I was just about to say, it's like when you run into someone post 2016.
Exactly.
You saw someone in a red hat and you had to wait until you got close up because you were just like, And then you saw, oh, you're like Kansas City Chiefs. Okay, gee, you know, and then it's like, wait, that's a racist hat.
You're like, wait a second, not better.
But you're like, you're still relieved, you know?
Yeah.
But anyway, that's definitely the energy of those t-shirts. It very much looks like Blue Lives Matter.
Exactly. And so you can get things like a camo zip up hoodie that is branded with their information. You can get just a range of wild things. In some ways, I appreciate their clarity. Like, I just appreciate I don't have to dig that far under the surface to see what is going on. So, Tim Ballard, as Sound of Freedom was being released, he is the founder of Operation Underground Railroad, and then he leaves quietly. So he was the founder and executive director. And then about when the film was released, he was quietly sort of no longer the director. He didn't like to bring it up. He still sort of affiliates himself. And he started another organization, which in your prophetic vision, he did exactly what you thought might happen. I will save you the effort of any more clicks that I will read. He's now with an organization called the Nazarene Fund.
Oh, yeah, obviously.
The Nazarene Fund, I'm just going to read maybe the first couple of sentences on their about page. The threat is real. News reports have talked about the defeat of ISIS. However, this evil organization is still wreaking havoc on thousands upon thousands of innocent people through the Middle East. ISIS also still controls large swaths of territory, mainly throughout Syria. Although many of the extremist fighters have returned to their homelands or traveled to other countries to spread their violent jihad, many remain with the hopes of building a caliphate or an Islamic state. Local fighters or sympathizers still loyal to the ISIS cause have blended into the population and continue to work on terrorist organizations' behalf. The ISIS threat is still very real. ISIS is still targeting and persecuting minorities in the region, and ISIS is still destroying the lives of thousands of captives and slaves under their control. It goes on like that for a long time.
Which is interesting because, it's blatantly false. It's Islamophobia, it's xenophobia, it's racist, it's warmongering, it's all of those things. They're just like slavery, crisis, kidnap, victim, save us, money. That's it. They're just saying the same things with new words over and over again. The human trafficking portion of this experience with Timothy Ballard is probably, and I am aggrieved to say this, more connected to reality than what you just read. At least human trafficking, okay, we can at least agree that is happening.
Yes. Human beings are being moved across borders for their labor and in exploitative ways. Absolutely, 100%. People are being exploited and moved across borders. 100% happening.
Mm-hmm. That is a real thing. The way that they describe it and their intervention in it, all of that is fallacy, falsehood, just riddled throughout it.
Just made up, straight up made up, most of it.
It's almost like he was like, okay, I can't do this thing that I also lied about. So I'm going to find another trigger point for conservative evangelical Christians, things that scare them, and I am going to be the boogeyman in their closet whispering that ISIS is doing all these terrible things, and then they will give me more money. I have a lot of religious trauma, and I have a lot of critiques of a lot of spiritual practices and faiths across the board. The one that I am the most harmed by and connected to, though, is the Christian church. It is the Christian denomination. So it doesn't matter if it's Lutheran or Baptist or non-denom. I've been through a lot of those. Catholic, things that are connected to the Christian theology, bad or liberatory, that is where my biggest sphere of influence is coming from. I'm imagining people hearing how sharp I feel, like the sharpness. And that is because bad theology creates things like this. It manufactures a problem that teaches us to practice self-hatred, that teaches us to hate other people, that teaches us to hoard wealth around those fallacies, and to indoctrinate our children into these spaces where it just gets perpetuated. And the amount of time that I have spent apologizing to my children for involving them in the Christian faith when I have witnessed that they are carrying something that I did not intend for them to pick up because I wanted them to be in a school that was fill in the blank that provided that need is a lot. A lot. I spend a lot of time actually. Every time it comes up, I'm just like, baby, I'm so sorry. I did not realize. And I should have. You can say I should have, but I also say that the fact that the Christian supremacy in this country is by design. And so the things that we are cultured into, my favorite smell in the world still is coffee and perfume. And that smell is the smell of sleeping in my mother's lap in a church pew, because that is how I spent my early years. And that means that there's a lot of things that I learned by being cultured into that I didn't even get an opportunity to consider whether what I was being told was not only true, but was it harmful? And what kind of life was it going to inspire me to create for myself? And what kind of restrictions and limitations was it going to place on my children and the way that they were able to navigate the world and the way that they think about other people? That is a tragedy to me. And so I have a problem with Christian theology in general. And it comes from a space of witnessing the way that survivors navigate healing as it is connected to the ways that the church has shamed them about things that happen to their bodies or the way that they choose to be in relationship to their bodies. And that is just one way. It's not a surprise that he shifted because, as you said, I had already called that out. And it's not a surprise the way that it happens. But I hope that people connect the bad theology, because I still don't even understand why we're giving money to churches, to be honest. I have no idea. I don't know why we're giving money to churches. I don't think that there is anything that a church can do that mutual aid couldn't do. I don't see the value in the same way that I think a lot of other people do. I just wanted to offer that as a clarification of what my experience has been with church and why I really have a very low tolerance for the kind of thinking that wants to preserve church culture and spirituality in the way that it exists today in the United States.
I was really sitting with as I was watching interviews with Tim Ballard and with Jim Caviezel to prepare for this. And just, it's a world I'm not in. And I don't ever hear that content. I don't, in my social media, I don't get it. I don't listen to those podcasts. It is like entering another world. And so I was just trying to sit with, okay, what is going on here?
When I read the scripture, I feel truth, good, evil, and I find the good. And let that just pierce the darkness. And it has to pierce. And I know what that light is. And I know that deception that when I start hearing about, for example, in your life, when there's two masters here. One is from the evil, wicked side, but he comes in through your ego. And the other one is the light side that tells you what you might not want to hear, but you ought to hear. And it's not manipulative. It's truth. So I go to that side. Then I pray, then I go through it. Like the Passion of the Christ, I looked at the Shroud of Turin. There were two men.
One of the things that felt most concerning for me is this piece that I see in a lot of, especially like evangelical Christianity, which is only looking for external threats. So this idea that there are bad, scary people out there. We are inside here. We are good, moral people who are ethically aligned. We're doing our work. So don't worry about it. I got it handled. I am with God. I am with Jesus. I have a Christian values. And so I am good and pure. And then there are evil people out there. And then as part of our ethical duty to fight the external evil people. And that threat of we are good in here and they are evil and bad out there. I know a lot of really horrible things happen inside that context. And so that is the thing that's so concerning to me is there's no, how they're talking about sex and sexuality and sort of arming to say like, okay, well, there's child pornography in all these ways. And I'm like, yeah, okay, tell me about the ethical sexual practices you have. How do I know you are a person who is practicing consent, who cares about the desire of your partner? You are suddenly very interested in truly horrific things that are happening. Your fascination with that seems very high to me, and I'm very curious about how you are ethically in good relationship with your own sexuality.
Thank you for saying that. One of my main concerns about this movie, and I was having a really hard time articulating what it is exactly, but there are moments in this film, again, do not watch it. There are moments in this film where I felt like it was fetishization.
Exactly that. It was a little too sexy. That thing sometimes where you see sexual violence in movies and then it's like soft lit, same way you'd light a romantic scene. There's a first scene where they dress up the kids for a modeling shoot that then they're sort of being trafficked out of. And I was like, you're actually just putting lipstick on this girl. I feel very freaked out by the sexualization of children you even have to do this thing.
So I have this theory, and it is not it is not peer reviewed. Uh, There's a couple different things that happen in the movie that felt like pornography in a fetishizing kind of way. One is this patriarchal, strong man, save the day vibe it's like that amosexual vibe where it's like, oh, he's going to come in with his gun and he's going to save the day. And look, he's saving this little girl and it's amazing. And like, wow.
Which is literally what he does.
It's literally the whole story. Yeah. And we know it's not true. So, like, okay, so that's a thing. But then there's this other piece where I'm like, I feel concerned about the ways that we consistently are informed that white conservative cis het men who are actively involved in work to end violence are perpetrating. We hear that all the time. They're in leadership, they're pastors. And those of us in the field know that a person who is doing harm can be just anyone, because we know that it's 90% is the children report that they know, love, and trust the person who harmed them. So it's their coach, it's their teacher, it's their uncle, it's people within their sphere of influence. And it is a situation that happens when there is too much power and unquestioned access to children. I'm thinking about all the white men watching this softly lit. There's a specific scene that I was very uncomfortable with. As I said, I watched it in parts because I did want to know, and I wanted to be on this journey with you. I wasn't going to leave you alone. And it did read to me as double-edged, where it's like if you were someone who is marketing for both Christian evangelical people and perpetrators of sexual violence, this would be the movie. This would be the movie, because the content is created in such a way that there's also the obfuscation or the imagination of being a person who has access to both worlds, which is the thing. I'm so glad you said that, because the theory that I have is that that Venn diagram is a circle, and that's why things are created that way. That's why the content that is coming out of not just this organization, but church-related content, movies, media, that is why it's set up that way. And someone should probably look into that. That seems like that's not great. And if I'm perceiving it that way,
it's an assignment.
Yeah, could someone please look into that for me and take care of it? Because if I'm perceiving it, I can't be the only one. It is very real. It is very real. And yeah, it's not okay. It's not okay. And as someone who also does a lot of storytelling for survivors, with survivors, by survivors, I also have a really big problem with the way that the people who experience the violence are portrayed in this sexualized manner. That is not the story. The story that you are telling is not how this person enjoyed this interaction of harm, like how this person was in the process of harming someone and what that felt like and looked. No one needs that. No one needs that information. The story of human trafficking is much more diverse and complicated. And first of all, it's not this story, but one of the most egregious things in this movie to me is in direct conflict with this idea of abolition is like, when have you ever in your fucking life ever had a cop feel so much sympathy for you and your plight as a victim of crime?
That they'll actually quit his job, leave his family, and then single-handedly go through the jungles of Colombia to save just you.
and be a mercenary, right? Like this is illegal what he's doing. It's not only illegal, the criminals don't love it either in this movie. Again, I want to remind everybody it's fake. The idea too is you're watching the movie that he drops into this community where clearly other people are also being exploited. And in a group of people, he whispers this child's name. And no one else says, hey, I too would like to be rescued. I too would like to go on the boat. He just leaves everybody else there. That's the whole story. Like, that is not a just response to community violence. We don't go in and get the person we like the most. If my child were missing, my child would be the only child that's missing. That's just a fact. But when we are designing a response to community violence from community, and even if we're talking police, whatever, we are not just rescuing the one person that tugs on our heartstrings. And even if we were, it would absolutely not be a police officer that chooses this one person over his career, because I can tell you that is a very, like, rare doesn't even begin to cover it. We can't even get people within offices of the city, county, state, federal to even acknowledge that diversity, equity, and inclusion work needs to be done, and to take the risk of losing their job to do that work. That's a hard thing to do. You think I'm going to get a cop to rescue my child in the wilds of Colombia because my child is what? This is never going to happen, people. It is never going to happen. And the reason why it's so egregious, we already talked about propaganda. You are sending a message to a large body of people that already support the police, whose children are going to be hurt and harmed. And they are going to look for a response. And this is not going to be what they get. And also, this is not going to be the thing that happens to them, which I'm going to let you. What is human trafficking, Shannon Perez Darby? Is this an accurate representation of human trafficking, do you think?
I'm definitely going to come back and answer that.
Okay.
But I also just wanted to share, exactly like you said, the reason this is so urgently upsetting to me is that it hides the true nature of violence and the true path forward, because it says that good, ethical, vigilante men are our solution to violence. And we instinctually, gut-wise, we know that's not right. And that it hides what is the true nature of violence, just like you said, which is that most people are harmed and most children are harmed by someone known to them. And so this highly racialized idea that then, as we see portrayed, is Black and brown men stealing pretty white girls.
Yes.
And that is the picture we have of child sex trafficking, particularly. That is a made up fear. It's a moral panic. It is a moral panic that's being created. And so, to this question of what is human trafficking in general, especially in the United States, is broken down into two categories. So, the category everybody salaciously loves to hear about, which is sexual exploitation or sex trafficking, and then labor trafficking. And what we know is that most people who are experiencing trafficking are being exploited because of their labor. So that is people who are being brought over to work in folks' homes, who then don't have access to their identification, to their passports, that don't have access to information about how to leave, that have language barriers, that then are working in some kind of domestic service inside someone's home. Childcare, cleaning, that is a common way that happens, or who are then being brought to work in different industries. That is the most kinds of when a human being is brought across a border and is not in charge of their own documents and cannot freely leave that situation. Labor trafficking is the primary vehicle for that experience. But that doesn't fill people's salacious pieces around, children are being exploited and chained in basements. And so then what happens is so many of these organizations that pop up that are claiming to be anti-sex trafficking organizations, that are started by people who watched a story on Dateline, felt compelled, have no connection to, have never had an experience of exploitation, don't identify as people who've been trafficked, who then jump in. And a lot of them are white Christian folks who jump in and say, okay, well, now we're going to do a rescue kind of work. completely divorced from people's meaningful experiences. And so in my work, I worked with a lot of queer and trans young people, a lot of Black and brown queer and trans young people who had experienced sexual violence and sexual exploitation. So, in a way where there was another human being who was exploiting their time, energy, money, bodies, sexuality. And because of the laws in the United States, if you are under the age of 18 and you are engaged in the sex trades, by our federal laws, you are a victim of sex trafficking. Domestic minor trafficking is any young person who is engaged in the sex trades. A survival strategy that some young people I would support would do is they would go hang out at the gay club. They would wait till last call. They would hit on men that were there. They would go home. They would sleep with those men. They'd have a place to stay. Sometimes those men would give them money. That was a survival strategy they were using. And in the United States, by our laws, those folks are victims of sex trafficking because they are young people, because you don't have to have shown force, fraud, or coercion. So we have created all these legal definitions that actually allows us to inflate the numbers to then where people are saying there are 20 million people enslaved across the world. Those are made up numbers that have been debunked over and over and over again. So you'll hear statistics that say things like the average age into prostitution is 12, 13, 14. And we can include in the show notes lots of different wonderful, reputable people who have shared about how those are just false statistics and some of the history. So Emi Koyama is a really brilliant feminist, queer, trans author and organizer who writes a lot about debunking some of these ideas that you hear both in the movie. So in Sound of Freedom, they parrot back these now debunked statistics about rates of trafficking, especially sexual trafficking of children and minors. And a lot of the interviews that Tim Ballard and Jim Caviezel give, they are also parroting back these false statistics. And so what it does is it creates this fake narrative that is actually highly divorced from people's experiences. And then there is so much violence to go around. And so I cannot say that there isn't a person who was kidnapped off the street and chained in a basement. Somebody has had that experience in the world, and we care deeply about that kind of harm. I care about when anybody is agency and body and self-determination is harmed. I care deeply about that. And taking those very small cases of the scale of which that kind of plucked off the street and then ritualistically abused and exploited over long periods of time and across borders, the scale at which that happens, people inflate that. And then they make this sort of false boogeyman that allows a lot of sketchy things to happen.
I want to just share a story. I was asked to bring yoga into a residential. It was a facility, but it was incarceration. I don't remember whether it was like a, juvenile facility or what, but they were trying to do services of mental health and things like that. And they had invited us to go and attempt to bring yoga. And one of the things that, while I was in the initial conversations with the team, one of the questions was, how do I convince this teenager that I'm going to use the words that were used on me? I'm not going to correct it. I have a teenager that is in prostitution, which we all know we call sex work, and they're doing it to get money. How do I convince them to not do that thing? Because the reason they're doing it is like, they'll do it and then just go get their nails done. To the person who was talking to me, it was clear that they didn't think that the way that the person was spending the money was worth the sex work that was happening. And I remember saying that is a real challenge, because when people do not have community to support them, they will survive in the ways that feel right to them. And if you are not going to provide that teen with the money they need, even to enjoy life beyond basic necessities that you have decided they need, then I will never be able to convince them that survival sex work is not a good idea. I'm just going to tell them no and not actually provide them with resources or community or support or mutual aid. I hear you that there are things that could be dangerous and harmful in that practice. And also, we have designed a situation we have made the conditions for this to happen through the way you have incarcerated this child. They can't go out and get a job, right? Like you've already created all of these constraints. But that takes me back to what you said earlier. Who are these people on the outside doing all this evil? Because a lot of these kids who are out here unhoused, our LGBTQ youth, are unhoused because their parents threw them out because they are queer or trans or gay, right? Right. And so, like, y'all are pointing fingers and you are actively pushing children. We have the data to show that you are actively pushing children out into a situation where they have not a lot of options on how they can support themselves, which then means that if they are doing survival sex work, if they are trapped in a labor trafficking situation, if they are in a situation where they are being sex trafficked, who then is responsible for that? Because honestly, I don't think that it's the children making bad decisions here. It's also important to name, you touched on this earlier too, sexual violence happens to all people who experience violence. And the more vulnerable you are, the more likely you're going to experience sexual violence. The less amount of faith that you have that systems will support you. If you are undocumented, if you are a teen that knows that they will take you home if you call the police and your home is violent or unsupportive in a way that makes you want to harm yourself, then you are going to exist within a vulnerable state. That means that the people who have power over you, they might be exploiting you for your labor, and also you're going to be at risk for sexual violence. And that intersection isn't trafficking, right? Like the intersection is how we create vulnerability for our own children, because we have bad theology and Christian supremacy that tells us that we have to get rid of our own children when they are showing the signs that they are the evil ones, because our church has told us that those people are evil. And so that is my problem. You have created the problem. And now you are trying to create a solution that is wrapped up in the lie that you are the savior and you know the right way. That's bold for sure, but it is indefensible.
And two things are happening simultaneously, right? Which is that people do what they need to do to survive.
That's right.
So when people do not have their needs met, when people are not safe, when they don't have access to money or ways to work in legal, safe, above board ways,
Mhm.
people figure out what they need to do to survive. That is important. Surviving is important. And the other thing is happening that you just so beautifully said is that we have conditions under which it makes it really unsafe for many people to survive. And we live in conditions of rape culture where most of us have pretty messed up relationships to consent, to healthy sexuality, just as a baseline before we ever get to exploitation. Most of us have pretty unhealthy relationships with equitable sexuality in our own selves and lives. And so we live in a culture that is pretty messed up about sex and sexuality, where rape culture is alive and well. So when you have conditions where people are doing what they needed to survive, inside rape culture, inside late stage capitalism, you create conditions where it makes it very unsafe for people who are engaged in the sex trades to survive. And that's not because there's anything inherently dangerous about trading sex for money or something else to survive. It's because we've created conditions where people are vulnerable and easier to exploit because it's illegal, because people don't have other meaningful access to safer ways to choice. One of the things that you'll hear me rail about a lot, and you'll hear many folks in the sex trades rail about, is that the safest way, if you're in the sex trades and you are doing sexual acts in person with folks for money, the safest way to do that is to have a mechanism to vet your clients. And so things like when there was Backpages, other kinds of websites, that is the safest way, because folks can have regular clients, they can have lists, they can have vetting mechanisms. And then often spurred by anti-trafficking folks and anti-trafficking groups, most of the places that folks could online safely vet clients have been shut down because of quote unquote trafficking issues that have actually pushed people in the sex trades to more and more dangerous conditions, to street-based sex trades, to places in which they can't meaningfully have control or can meaningfully vet clients so that they are safer. And so things that are supposed to quote unquote end trafficking and end sex trafficking particularly is actually just making people in the sex trades less safe. And those are some of the reasons I care deeply about this. I do want to touch on two pieces of legislation about the kind of like, why do we care? So one is anyone who's my friend has had to listen to me talk about this, and no one's that interested, but it is very related, which is it's like a niche that's very specific. So on April 5th, 2023, Idaho passed the abortion trafficking law in response to the Dobbs decision that kicked the question of abortion rights back to states. We've seen a state by state strategy where different states are working to ban abortion at different scales, at different levels, kind of wherever they can. The law that was passed in Idaho that functionally made abortion illegal or inaccessible, especially for folks under the age of 18, so for minors, is that they piggybacked on their anti-trafficking laws. So they originally had domestic minor human trafficking laws saying you can't transport a minor for the purposes of illegal activity. And so instead of actually banning abortion through any kind of explicit reproductive rights kinds of bills, they just tacked abortion onto their anti trafficking bill. So then that's why it's called the abortion trafficking law. So what happens in Idaho is if you are in Western Idaho, Spokane is just over the border into Washington state. And so there's a Planned Parenthood in Spokane where you can get open access to abortion. And so many people from Idaho then cross the border, they go to Spokane. And then this law is trying to say that it is trafficking if you took a minor across state lines in order to access an abortion. And so they are using the framework of trafficking to impact the reproductive rights, especially of young people. There is no rape or incest exclusion in those. So if you were a 16-year-old who experienced sexual violence, there's no plan. If you have an auntie who wants to take you to Spokane to make sure that you can get access to an abortion, now that auntie is quote unquote trafficking you. And I don't know why every person is not urgently freaked out and paying attention to the connections between the anti-trafficking work that I think people sometimes seem as like wacky, but like benign. But they are really good at passing laws. And those laws are they're not just staying in their box of anti-trafficking. They're actually use this creep to move more and more towards carceral solutions, towards less control over particularly women's bodies. And we should all be urgently paying attention to that and freaked out about that.
Right, because that is also going to be connected to how the United States is going to start policing gender affirming care. In Michigan, there was a law that is not going to go forward, but the intention was to charge parents who gave their children gender affirming care with first degree child abuse. For those of you who do not know, that's the worst kind. That's like we go into prison. This is not like you're going to get a fine. This is not what happens when you don't mandatory report and you get like your $500 fine. This is like life altering removal of your life and your children and your freedom. And so the reason why that law freaks me out is because of that piece too. It is this fear mongering that is easily supplanted with other things that Christian evangelical people have decided for the rest of us that it is not okay. When we have, and this is not everybody, but it should be, we have a thing that we say. We say sex work is work. Sex work is work. Everybody should support sex workers. You know, like that's like a very common refrain within leftist communities. But what happens when we have youth who do want to do sex work, that want to grow up and be a sex worker, and we have completely demolished the history of sex work, the elders, the people who know about Backpage, the people who know how to stay safe, the people who know how to practice safe sex in all different contexts, not just staying safe medically, but physically. There is a body of knowledge there that we don't have access to because it keeps getting further buried. Another example in Michigan, we just passed a law to end child marriage in the state of Michigan, which on face value, similar to many pieces of legislation, it's like, of course, we don't want children to be forced into marriage, obviously. I did have meetings with our state senator, Sarah Anthony. This is something that she was working on, I believe, with Kara Hope, who's also a senator. My concern is that there isn't actually a lot of information about who is actually performing these marriages? Is it parents who are allowing it? Is it religious community? Is it trafficking? Is it like, what is it? Who are these children? We do know that there are underage people who are getting the consent of elders to marry older people. I don't feel comfortable with that either. But what I also know is that when we police things in a way that threatens violence by the state, then it's not like, especially religious people haven't ever had marriage ceremonies in their house. So if you take away the legal way for people to get married, and again, I am not advocating for child marriage. I'm just saying, like, we have an opportunity to study it and to know what exactly is happening. We had an organization that is led by a survivor who was forced into early marriage, and there were devastating consequences, which is real. But this is also why we often say that your lived experience cannot be your political framework, because it got parachuted into Michigan. We have done no research. And my question to that organization was like, well, will you introduce me to the people in my state who have experienced this? Will you pass them through so that I can provide them with services in their home community? Can you give me tools? I've never dealt with child marriage specifically. I don't really know. In my experience, I don't know a lot about that. And of course, it falls under, there's a lot of things that there's parallels, but I don't know a lot about it. No, they couldn't. And they were like, that's not really our role. Then my question is, what the fuck are you doing here? If you're going to be here to suggest a law that will change the way that we are able to respond to an act of violence on children, and you don't have any tools, any tips, any data, any evidence-based research, none of that outside of anecdotal or research that's happened elsewhere, you're actually creating a barrier. You're making it so that I can't actually see the problem now. And it's deeper. And so now what am I supposed to do about it? So it feels very similar, where it's like problems need to be visible, and it's painful to see that these things are happening, and I don't love it. And I wish we could just make laws and everybody's brains would go, oh, we have a law, child marriage is wrong. We're not going to come up with all these other ways to harm children. That's not the reality. And so I really need people to disconnect their belief system from like this idea that laws actually change behavior, because it doesn't. And what laws tend to do is just drive people further into secret, into hiding, into isolation. It makes it harder for people like you and me to actually get access to them.
Yeah. One of the other pieces of legislation that is going through the legislative process in Alabama right now. So I have no idea how viable this law was. State Representative Donna Givens introduced the Sound of Freedom Act in Alabama.
It doesn't sound like freedom. I'll tell you that right now.
Exactly. It's actually literally the opposite of freedom, which would automatically sentence individuals convicted of child trafficking to life in prison. Under the current Alabama law, first-degree human trafficking is already a Class A felony, punishable by 20 to life in prison. And then the Sound of Freedom Act amendment would dictate that the court impose a life sentence mandatory. A lot of the research on this and going down this rabbit hole is a lot of people saying the quiet part out loud. Oh, yeah, no, we're going to use this story to actually increase criminalization, to put more Black and brown men, particularly in prison, based on a largely fabricated heroic narrative of white Christians. That is explicitly what's happening, without a meaningful understanding about how life in prison would support someone who had experienced violence and exploitation. That somehow a healing activity for someone who had had that experience. You know, a thing I want to say that I notice I'm feeling as we're recording this is that in the anti-violence work I've done, this issue has some of that third rail feeling, where it is a really hot button issue. Actually, just this week on Instagram, a relatively progressive but mainstream anti-violence organization posted something on their website that was like, sex work isn't trafficking, or some version of that. And for that kind of organization is a pretty radical thing to say, even though for me and my community, especially I think a lot of queer and trans people who have a deep, long historical and current relationship to sex work and the sex trades, I'm like, yeah, of course. Like, what? Already there were comments under that just being like, no, prostitution is exploitation. Why would an anti-violence organization say this? I've never been in meetings with peers who I otherwise might have agreed with that have been so intense as talking about this issue. I've watched people shout each other down in relatively like chill, kind of passive aggressive white nonprofit spaces where people don't really yell at each other. And this is the issue where people have just like duked it out. And maybe we'll get our first take comments. I can feel that in this issue because it has that kind of intensity in it. I always come back to like, what do I know? What I know is that supporting survivors and self determination, when people have experienced violence and exploitation, they get to tell the story. I know that racism and anti-blackness is an essential component that is the like bedrock of these conversations. It is a highly racialized conversation that gets erased from the narrative. Oh, we're not actually talking about a racialized thing. We're just talking about exploited children. And I know that I do not trust most people in the United States, particularly white folks, to talk in grounded, ethical ways about borders and about humans crossing borders. I'm not like, oh, that's gone really great. And suddenly you seem very concerned about how people are being brought across borders against their will. Like you seem very urgently caring only about this question and not about other ways in which people are moving across borders in ways that honors their self-determination. And so like those are things I know. And the counter narrative to this is so intense that I can just feel the nervousness of just saying things that I know to be true for me and my communities and my people, and how tense that is for folks.
I'm sure that someone's gonna be like, you want youth to have access to sex workers so they can learn how to be sex workers? I'm like, I want youth to have access to whatever is autonomous and safe and free and what they are choosing for themselves. Here's what I know, since we're naming things that we know. I know that when people say that they always equate sex worker prostitution to exploitation, my question would be, then who does our body belong to? And I think what they're actually saying is your body is not yours to do what you wish with. Your body belongs to the church, the religion, the state, and they get to determine how your body is used. And if it isn't used in service of fill in the blank, then you are a crime. And your life is a crime. And the way you do things needs to be policed and imprisoned and controlled. All of that is wrong. That is not liberation. Our bodies actually do belong to us. Our pleasure, our desire, the ways that we exchange whatever for whatever, that's ours, that's mine. This past week, I was watching Percy Jackson and the Olympians. There's this moment in it that reminded me how the way we talk about trauma before it happens is almost more important than what we do after. And the reason that this came up for me was because there's this moment where Percy's mother is looking at him in a moment of fear and crisis where he's like, can I do this thing? And it's like an identity moment. He's this demigod. He doesn't know who he is. He's just finding out who his family is and what's supposed to happen in his life. And he's like, I have always been a weirdo. Like, this moment is real. And she looks at him and she said, Percy, you are not broken. You are singular. You are a miracle. Ah, girl. But the reason we do not believe that we are singular, that we are a miracle, that we can heal and live beyond these things that have happened to us is because we have already built a narrative that our bodies do not belong to us, that we don't get to choose how to be in our bodies. We don't get to choose our lovers. We don't get to choose where we live because of redlining. We don't get to choose what we eat because of food apartheid. We don't even get to choose whether we can keep our loved ones because of prisons and jails and the ways that we practice surveillance in this country. I think a part of what is really alive for me, especially in this moment of time where we are seeing the snapback of white supremacy and Christian supremacy and all the control that comes from that, is this urgency around no, this body, this is a sovereign land. This is mine. And that means that if I want to trade it for a bag of hot fucking Cheetos, then I get to do that because it's mine. And we don't get to practice autonomy in this country that we should be able to, on this land that doesn't belong to us. And I know that people can't necessarily in their brains get there. I know it takes time, but what I really do believe is that there is a journey towards liberation, and it starts with us. And that means we have to take ownership of ourselves before we think we can take ownership of the liberation of other people. If we don't do that, we are always going to be having these struggles around shame and harming one another and approaching our own self-hatred by hurting and policing and controlling other people. That's not a recipe for healing. That is a recipe for even more replication of violence and harm. And I don't want to live in that world. And I will also say that I will put as much of your links and receipts into the show notes. And if y'all want to argue, you can argue with your mama and read those links, because it is not my job to get you to the lesson. My job in this world, my vocation, is to tell you the truth. This is the truth. This is the reality. And you can be mad if you want to. The truth makes me mad all the time. Every time I get a bill, it just is the reality. But you're not mad at me. You are mad at the system that was created and the conditions and all the things that come from it. There is a lengthy list of people you can send emails to. It's not us.
I adore that. I adore you. I think that is so beautiful. One of the things that made me so uncomfortable watching it was watching Tim's relationship with children. It was inappropriate. One of the things that was so upsetting to me is one of the first scenes, Miguel is taken from this white man at the border. He's taken to the ICE, like Homeland Security offices. And then Tim takes Miguel in his private car. He's like gone to a doctor. The doctor's confirmed that he's been sexually assaulted. And then this man takes this boy in his car out to get burgers, and then starts disclosing to him about his family and being like, I have children too, and bonding with him. And in my notes, I just wrote in all caps, that is grooming behavior. So to take a child who has just been sexually assaulted by a white man, he doesn't know you. You're not known to him. You speak marginal Spanish at best. Even with this 8-year-old boy who has just had massive amounts of trauma, that is not a trauma-informed practice. If you are a human who is doing work for your job, you interact with children, you do not take them in your vehicle, private places where other people don't know where you are, and then start disclosing to them about your life. It's just as a modeling for ways to care for a child who has just been abused. It is horrific. It's entirely for him. It's not for Miguel. There's nothing about that is in service of Miguel. It is entirely for Tim to feel like he is a hero. And it was so freaked out and so appalled by that. This is not a modeling of how to care for children in any way, shape, or form. It's creepy. And also for a child who has just been abused. Like, what the fuck are you doing?
And not only all of that is 100% on point. Thank you for saying that. Not only that, but even people who work in child advocacy centers would say that that is wildly inappropriate. Even cops would say that that is wildly inappropriate. There is no excuse for interviewing a child after having experienced what they have framed as a horrific experience of child sexual abuse in a public diner over French fries. It's absolutely 100% not okay. And I will add to that if you know a child that discloses to you and you are wanting to help, the best thing you can do is not do that. You don't deserve the details. Get that baby some help.
He needs to like be with his dad or a skilled therapist, a skilled social worker, anyone who has experience around how to do this task. And I supported children, young people who experienced domestic and sexual violence for 10 years. And not once did I ever drive any of those young people in my private car around at any places. I was able to meaningfully provide them support, and that is some way to protect them, to say, hey, let's make good relationships where I don't normalize private, secret, invisible things where no one can see us. If I met them in public, we met at Panera, right? In back booths or in the privacy of our confidential offices or on the phone where they were in control of where they were. It's for them about normalizing behavior, but it's also to protect me as a worker, to be able to say, if anything I wanted to say, I was like, great, I've actually never been in unmonitored spaces with young people. That's actually a great way to counter rape culture, to just counter a vibe that you just might be privately with with a young person who's just experienced sexual trauma, don't do that. Exceptions to that are the differences between being a worker and also like in my private life. If my nibblings wanted to share something personal, like I have a deep trusting relationship with them inside community, inside family. Yes, I'm driving them in my private vehicle all the time because that's a relational thing versus like the worker relationship.
One of the things that I say when a person comes to me that I'm in relationship with, not even through work, right? And they're just like, this thing has happened and my child has been harmed. And I know that it is my job to get the therapist, to do this, to do that. There's all these things depending on the situation that is the system response that I'm supposed to follow. What should we do? And there have been many times where I have been like, yes, I understand. If this is the route that you want to go to get this goal, this is the system you need to go through. But what I would also really say is you're about to introduce your child to a really complicated, heartbreaking, difficult, disappointing system response to something that was traumatic and violent and has changed the way that they view the world. And what I really hope that you remember and prioritize is actually just being present with your kid in a really sad moment, making sure that they're home, that they feel safe, that you are in it with them, that you are in the next room if that's what it takes, or sitting next to them on the couch. If you are canceling sporting events and family functions to spend time together, that you are just fully with them, because the system will have its response, but like our first response as family, as beloveds, as community should not be, who do I tell that this happened? In my opinion, I know that that is a part of what we do. But for me, I'm always like, if you are not the professional that's required to hold these other details, then I really want you to not be the professional. I don't want you to do interviews. I don't want you taking photos and screenshots and doing all of this. I want you to make breakfast for your kid. I want you to talk to their teachers. And I don't think that we say that enough to parents. You, as a safe space and a container, is critical to how they experience all the rest of the hard things that are coming your way. And you also need to probably be rallying your community around both of you. I also just want to say there are going to be people that are going to have a hard time with this episode and some of the things that we've said. But I also want to speak to the people who are like my dear friend Shannon, who are in those rooms, right? Like we are in those rooms and trying to, even with people who we have been in relationship with, doing this work, shared values, shared vision in a lot of ways, that this is a hard thing. It is a hard thing. And we have always needed people like you. We have always needed people who are willing to take the risk and say, no, actually, that's not true. That's not true. You're not maybe on this side of vision yet. You don't know the world is round yet, my friend, but I promise you that if you look through this telescope with me, I promise you that we're going to get there and you're going to see it. And the way you're going to see it is you're going to know that you deserve better, that you are valuable just by existing, that your own body is sovereign, and then you can take that and protect other people in the same way. And that is possible because people do it. We have a legacy of people doing this work and showing up and being brave and losing their job. And it's not pretty. It is not without its heartbreak and without its relationship ruptures. Our job, if we were hired by the future, is to not back down from that. If I was being employed by the future that we want to see, I have to fully show up. This is the gig. High five to my beautiful friend Shannon. You can't see it, but she just got a high five because that's the role. It's hard.
That's very beautiful. Made me tear up a little bit.
It's so important what you do. It's so important what you do. And there's no one else in those rooms that will do it. And that is even more critical. There are other people, maybe one, and then there's always the one who whispers to you outside the door. It's like, you did a good job. Thank you so much. But they don't say anything in the meeting.
Yeah, exactly.
But the only thing that puts that voice in that room is people like you. And that doesn't, so thank you for your work. And thank you for walking me through this horror show that is Sound of Freedom, because it's such an important conversation.
Thank you for joining me. I feel so grateful for your willingness to sit through this and your sweetness. I just really in my feels today. And so I'd appreciate the tenderness and being able to have this conversation. There is something urgent to me about unveiling the story that is happening in this corner of anti-trafficking and sex trafficking and Sound of Freedom. There is a story there, and it is urgent to me that we bring it into the light about what's really happening.
Mm-hmm.
To support Popaganda, please like, subscribe, and leave a 5-star review. It really makes a difference.